A god built from 10,000 years of sacrifice steps into a universe that has not yet learned what it costs. The air here carries no incense, no machine prayer, no the weight of a species maintaining itself on borrowed time. It carries something older and simpler, the clean heat of potential burning without chains. He has spent an eternity deciding what humanity must be. Here, something that wears humanity's shape has not yet been told. The question that remains is not whether the Emperor of mankind can endure what Marvel throws against him. The question is what it does to him to see, for the first time in 10,000 years, what he was always fighting to protect. The Phoenix Nexus above Kyrath's Rest had been burning for 4 days when Kosator Vale stopped sleeping. Not from fear, though fear would have been rational. She stopped sleeping because sleep required a threshold of psychic quiet that the Nexus no longer permitted, and the Nexus no longer permitted quiet because something inside it had been moving for months without anyone noticing, and now it had decided to stop moving quietly and start moving with purpose. Kyrath's Rest was a dead world. Had been dead for 3 centuries, ever since the Phoenix Force had passed through this quadrant and left behind glass plains and copper-scented stone and the particular silence of a place that had held life and then been relieved of it. The research colony that had occupied its northern continent was a memory now, recorded in Shi'ar Neocortex archives, and nowhere else. Nobody came here. Nobody had reason to. Which was exactly why Kosator Vale had been stationed at Nexus Point 7 with 3 monitoring instruments, a standard communications array, and the standing instruction to report any anomalous Phoenix-adjacent readings immediately. She had reported immediately. She had been reporting for 4 days. The station above Kyrath's Rest had gone from 3 monitoring instruments to 37, from 1 telepath to a full psychic support staff of 11, from a standard comms array to a military-grade transmission hub that connected directly to the Relentless Understanding, Grand Commander Thalar Vek's flagship, which now hung in formation with 5 other capital warships at the 2,000-unit perimeter line that Vek had established on Day 2. Thalar Vek was a broad-shouldered Shi'ar officer of the upper military caste, gold and black armor, bearing the 8-pointed star of the Guard's highest distinction, with the jaw and bearing of a man who had survived 3 planetary sieges and a Skrull infiltration of the High Council's innermost chamber. He was not a man who used phrases like, "I do not know what that is," and he had now used it 11 times in 4 days. The Phoenix echo at the center of the Nexus had begun as a ripple, a flicker in psionic background radiation that should have registered clean. By hour 12 it was a sustained column of psychic fire, cycling through frequency ranges that Kosator Vale had no classification system for, not because the classification systems were inadequate, but because the frequencies themselves seemed to be responding to something, bending toward an attractor she could not identify. Not the Phoenix Force malfunctioning, the Phoenix Force being used. On the morning of Day 4, Vale submitted her 72nd hour report, accepted a cup of the bitter stimulant drink that the monitoring station's fabricator produced in approximate and joyless imitation of real kaf, and sat in the dark of the forward observation bay with her hands flat on the console and her mind open to the column of fire outside. She had been a telepath first class for 23 years. She had made contact with Kree battle channelers, with Skrull psi operatives mid-shapeshifting, with the dormant geometric intelligences of sleeping celestials, and with the Phoenix Force itself for the 0.4 of a second that her emergency disconnect hadn't been fast enough to prevent. She knew what foreign intelligence felt like. She knew how to approach something that was not built like her mind. She knew, above all, the difference between a thing that was simply powerful and a thing that had purpose. The Nexus column contained both, and the purpose was not the Phoenix's. She pressed her awareness toward it, carefully, layered shields up, graduated approach, the way she might approach a wounded animal that was also capable of killing her, and found, at the very edge of her reach, something that she had been circling for days without being able to name. It was contamination. Something was inside the Phoenix Echo that was not the Phoenix, working with the patience of a surgeon and the silence of something that expected no one would notice, something that had been there for a long time, something that was nearing the end of its patience. Kosator Vale pulled back. She wrote up her findings in the 73rd hour report. She transmitted it to Thalar Vek. He read it in 40 seconds. "Get to the forward observation bay," he said. "I am coming aboard." She was already there. What happened next happened at 0311 Standard, station time. The Phoenix column, which had been burning in its contested frequencies for 96 hours, simply stopped. Not extinguished. Not dispersed. It collapsed inward to a single point of white fire above Kyrath's glass plains, and then that point opened like an eye, and through the eye came something that every instrument on every ship in Thalar Vek's formation attempted to classify, and could not. A human shape. That, at least, the surveillance systems agreed on. Not large by the standards of cosmic entities, a figure the height and general proportion of a tall human male, wearing robes and armor that carried the weight of something that did not register on visible wavelengths, projected into material existence from what had been empty space, with the comfort of a man stepping from one room into another. The figure turned its head, taking in the warship formation, the dying Phoenix column behind it, and the dead world below, with the measured attention of something that had walked into difficult rooms for a very long time. Then, with the patience of geological time, it looked directly at the relentless understanding. Kosator Vale exhaled slowly. Her biosignal trackers were burning at full active range. Her hands had not moved. Her voice, when she transmitted to Thalar Vek, was as steady as she had trained it to be over 23 years. "Grand Commander, it is not a weapon. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is a person." She paused. There is a distinction being maintained between person and what it actually is, and the distinction appears deliberate. "Can you read it?" Vile reached. She touched. She pulled back immediately, the way a hand pulls back from something that is far hotter than it looked. Not damaged, not burned, simply overwhelmed by the scale of contact, the way a candle is overwhelmed not by wind, but by the discovery of the sun. "No," she said. "Not in any conventional sense," she breathed. "It is a consciousness that has been burning for a very long time, without cooling. It is—" She stopped, tried again. "It is grief shaped into purpose, Grand Commander. That is the closest I can come." Thalar Vek was silent for 2 seconds. "Open a channel." The channel opened. The figure in the void waited, unhurried. "Unidentified entity. You have entered restricted Shi'ar Imperial space without authorization. Identify yourself and state your purpose, or you will be fired upon." The voice that answered was not loud. It did not need to be. It came across the channel with the weight of something that had been speaking from positions of absolute authority for longer than the Shi'ar Imperium had been an imperium, and every word of it carried the specific resonance of a consciousness too large for the medium it was using. "I am looking for the thing that came here before me. It has buried itself in the psychic construct your ships are monitoring. If you fire on me, you will delay me and destroy yourselves. I suggest instead that we speak." Thalar Vek, who had received communications from genuinely every class of entity the galaxy contained, took the specific pause that Kosator Vale had learned to recognize in him when he was recalibrating. "State your name, a beat, then. You may call me the Architect, though the thing I am hunting has more claim to that title than I do. Can you be harmed by your weapons? In this form, with sustained effort, yes. Then you will submit to standard containment protocols and come aboard the Relentless Understanding voluntarily. You will be received in the primary containment chamber and assessed by our psychic support staff." The figure looked at the flagship, looked at it the way a mountain looks at weather. "Send your telepath," it said. "The one who reached toward me and pulled back. I will come aboard when she asks me to." Kosator Vale stared at the open channel. Then she looked at Thalar Vek. He looked at her. "Go," he said. She went. The shuttle that carried her across the 2,000-unit gap was technically unnecessary for a rendezvous with an entity that had demonstrated the ability to materialize through empty space, and both Vale and the figure waiting outside understood this. The shuttle was protocol. Protocol was the structure that kept professional people functional when events exceeded their frame of reference. Vale appreciated protocol. She spent 7 of her 11 minutes of shuttle transit reviewing Shi'ar psychic first contact protocols for entities of unknown classification. She spent the remaining 4 with her eyes closed, building the layered mental architecture she used in deep contact situations. Graduated shields, approach vectors, the practiced scaffolding of a mind that intended to come back from whatever it touched. Through the viewport, the figure resolved into clarity. The armor it wore was gold and white and damaged in ways that looked permanent. The damage of something that had taken catastrophic wounds long ago and was simply no longer concerned with the cosmetic distinction between scarred and unmarked. The face above the armor was the face of a very old human, features that had been striking once and were now something that had moved past striking into another category entirely. The way mountains are not beautiful but simply are. The eyes were not lit with any light she recognized. They simply knew things. They processed everything they looked at as part of a continuous ledger of accumulated information that had been running for longer than she could meaningfully compute. They looked at her through the viewport with the specific quality of attention that very powerful minds gave to things they considered interesting. Vale opened the channel. "I am Cositor Vale, telepath first class, Shi'ar Imperial Guard. You requested my presence. I requested that you ask me to come aboard," the figure said. "The distinction is meaningful. Why? Because I am a guest, not a prisoner. Because I come voluntarily, or I do not come at all. Because the willingness to make the distinction tells me something about the quality of the minds I am dealing with." A pause. "Ask me," Vale breathed. "Will you come aboard the Relentless Understanding as a guest of the Shi'ar Imperial Guard, on your honor to refrain from hostile action unless attacked, to cooperate with our assessment, and to share what you know about the contamination in the Phoenix Nexus?" The figure looked at her for a long moment with those ancient, weighing eyes. "Yes," it said, "on those terms." It stepped through the hull of the shuttle as though the hull were smoke. Cositor Vale registered this on the distant academic level she reserved for things that should not be possible, and chose not to react to it visibly, because there were categories of events that telepath first-class officers did not react to visibly, and a being walking through ferrocite as a courtesy was one of them. "Thank you," she said. "Tell me about the archivist," the figure said, settling into the shuttle's passenger seat with the deliberate courtesy of something that understood the value of appearing comprehensible. "Shi'ar, male, the one who has been monitoring the Phoenix Nexus longest from the secondary console." Cositor Vale went still. "Archivist Arian Dulavar, assigned to this station 4 months ago. Why?" "Because the contamination in the Phoenix Nexus was placed there by something working through a vessel. The signature matches an entity class from my universe, a construct serving a god of deliberate complexity and infinite deception. It did not arrive through the breach I made. It has been here for weeks, working from inside your station, through someone trusted enough to have access without question." The figure looked at her steadily. "Your archivist has been compromised for at least 3 months. The silence in the shuttle was absolute. "That is a significant accusation," Vale said carefully. "It is not an accusation, it is a diagnosis." The figure, the Emperor, Vale had begun thinking of it that way, though she did not yet know why, watched her face with the patience of something accustomed to waiting for people to process information at their own speed. "The man you remember as your colleague is still present. What occupies him has been careful not to destroy him but to layer itself over him, suppressing his will while preserving his knowledge and his behavioral patterns. This technique requires months of preparation, considerable patience, and a tolerance for leaving the host functional. These are the specific hallmarks of the entity I am tracking across universes." Vale said, "Across universes. I came through a dimensional barrier. You observed this." "I observed something come through a dimensional barrier. I have not yet confirmed what that something is." A pause. Something shifted in the figure's expression, not amusement exactly, but the recognition of a mind working correctly in circumstances that discouraged it. "Practical," it said. "Good. You are more useful than I expected." It turned to look out the viewport at the Phoenix column, now dying down to embers. What is at the center of that column is not Phoenix Force anomaly, it is Phoenix Force contamination. Something has been inside it for months, using the fluctuation as cover, and is now using it as amplifier, and will shortly attempt to use it as instrument. If it succeeds in that final step, it will establish a resonance window between this universe and mine, a stable enough dimensional passage for things that are currently contained in my reality to cross into yours. Things meaning what? Gods, the Emperor said. The genuine article, not the kind your universe calls gods, not elder beings operating at high energy levels, the kind that are made of distilled suffering and collective faith, and that grow stronger the more they are opposed or worshipped, the kind that your universe is not equipped to encounter because it has not developed the specific theological and psychic countermeasures that my universe learned through 10,000 years of catastrophic failure. Cossiter Val processed this. She did what she always did when processing something outside her existing frame. She moved it to the category marked Actionable Intelligence and stopped arguing with it. Grand Commander Vec needs to hear this. He will find it difficult to believe. He doesn't have to believe it. He has to act on it. The Emperor looked at her again with that ancient, measuring attention, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not quite, but the recognition of something he had not expected. Yes, he said, exactly. They were 11 minutes aboard the Relentless Understanding when the secondary communications channel lit with a priority transmission, a burst of psychic static originating from within the monitoring station itself, carrying the Shi'ar military encryption code used for emergency alerts. It contained no words. It pressed against the psychic sensitivities of every telepath in the formation, and left behind it the specific quality of silence that follows the slamming of a very large door. The Emperor stood. He had been seated, Vale had noticed, because he had chosen to be seated, because it made the soldiers in the room slightly less afraid, and he was a tactician of environments as well as battles. He looked toward the station. He knows we have had this conversation, the Emperor said. He is no longer pretending. Arayan Dulavar's signal had been precise, targeted, not broadcast outward but inward, into the minds of every susceptible individual within the monitoring station's hull. The 9 who fell were not the weakest among the station's personnel. They were the 9 whose specific psychic architecture the contamination had been quietly mapping for 3 months, identifying the exact threshold frequency that would suppress will without destroying function. The thing that wore Dulavar's face with his eyes running the dark amber of sustained corruption stood at the center of the primary deck and looked at the sealed door to the secondary monitoring chamber with an expression that carried Dulavar's features arranged in a configuration Dulavar had never worn. He arrived exactly within the calculated window, it said, in Dulavar's voice and not Dulavar's cadence. Too measured, the words placed with a precision that organic speech did not naturally achieve. Most probable is not certain. It is gratifying when the variables elect to cooperate. The 9 moved on the sealed door with the methodical patience of water finding a crack. Thalar Vec hit the emergency quarantine seal 3 seconds before the first of them reached the ferrocite. 6 more blast panels dropped. He was already on the command channel. Vale, report. Contained in secondary monitoring, the entity is with me. Her voice carried the precise amount of tension that conveyed information without impeding function. 9 compromised personnel on primary deck. The archivist has triggered whatever he was positioned to trigger. The contamination is accelerating, the Emperor said, not to Thalar Vec, not to Vale, but in the tone of someone updating an internal record. It is attempting to complete the resonance window before I can interfere with the Nexus architecture directly. He turned. I need access to the Nexus. Within psychic interfacing range. At a distance I can slow this. I cannot stop it at range. Thalar Vec, through the channel, define direct access. Proximity to the Phoenix fluctuation, line of sight from the secondary monitoring chamber's forward viewport, is sufficient for initial assessment. Closer is better. And the second thing you need, Cossiter Vale said. She had already pulled the intelligence file. Jean Davar, the Emperor confirmed. The mutant. She carries a Phoenix resonance pattern, not a full force echo, something older, a sympathetic frequency, built into her specific psychic architecture. Her mind is the only one in this reality that is structurally compatible with mine, At the level of depth this operation requires, I need another psyker to hold a constant that the contamination cannot calculate for. The entity we are dealing with is Xinqian. It adapts. It modifies its architecture in response to whatever approach is used against it. A single attacker, no matter how powerful, can be outmaneuvered by something with sufficient time and sufficient complexity. Two attackers, operating on different architectural principles, create a variable the adaptation cannot solve for. Jean Devar is on Earth, Vale said. I know. Earth is several jumps from here. I know. Then we have a timing problem, Vale said. How long before the situation becomes uncontrollable? The Emperor was quiet for exactly the amount of time the calculation required. 8 to 10 hours before the resonance window opens sufficiently for the first crossings. I can hold the window compressed for that long. I will not be able to hold it longer. He met Vale's eyes with the directness of something that did not flinch from the weight of information. Get her here. Whatever method you have, use it. I will hold. Thalar Vek, already on a secondary channel to his fastest courier, said nothing. He had the quality of the very best commanders. When the situation exceeded his frame of reference, he stopped trying to understand it and started trying to solve what he could solve. The ferrocite blast panel on the secondary monitoring chamber's starboard access door deformed inward, not breached, deformed, pressed from the outside by the methodical distributed force of 9 bodies arranged against it in the configuration that water uses when filling a crack, not attacking it, filling it. Open the blast panels, the Emperor said. Vek, on the channel. That will admit 9 compromised. Open them. I need room to work. In tight quarters, the contamination uses them as a mechanism. Give them space, and they become individuals. He paused. I will not harm them. Thalar Vek opened the panels. The 9 entered in a single flowing movement, and the Emperor of Mankind turned to receive them. He did not fight them. He reached into the psychic architecture of each mind and found the specific thread the contamination had placed. Thin and precise and blue-silver, Xinqian in color and construction, and pulled. 9 threads, 9 simultaneous extractions. Not with the force of a weapon, but with the precision of a surgeon removing sutures that had been placed incorrectly. The thread lifted cleanly from the architecture beneath it, without damage to the host. The 9 stopped moving. The light in their eyes changed. 7 collapsed. The sudden return of themselves was apparently enormous. 2 remained standing. Both wore the expression of people sorting through the last several hours of their own behavior. Both looked sick. You are yourselves again, the Emperor said, in a voice that carried authority and something that was not quite gentleness, but was in the same neighborhood. You were used. That is finished. Rest. Thalar Vek, on the channel, was silent for 4 full seconds. That was not what I expected. They were not my enemies, the Emperor said. The thing that compelled them was. He straightened. Clear the chamber. What arrives when the archivist comes will not be safe for observers. It knows I have freed these people, which means it has lost the strategy it was deploying against me. It will be angrier than it was, and it will no longer be patient. The room cleared. Cositor Vile, at the door, stopped. Should I be concerned, she said, about what happens when the 2 of you are in the same room? Be concerned about what happens if it escapes this one, the Emperor said. Send the message to Jean Devar. She went. The ferrocite door sealed with the weight of finality. Outside the viewport, the Phoenix Nexus pulsed once. A deep, slow, heartbeat pulse. The rhythm of something very old becoming aware that the thing inside it had just been isolated. Arian Dulavar walked through the sealed door as though it had not been there. The thing in Dulavar's body no longer wore Dulavar's face with any care for the performance. The archivist's form was arranged around it with the unconcerned posture of a garment outgrown, the weight distributed wrongly, the head tilted at the angle of something that did not experience gravity as a personal concern. The eyes ran with copper light, and through the copper light moved patterns, self-organizing sigils that assembled and dissolved and reassembled in configurations that the Emperor recognized with the bone-deep familiarity of someone who had fought the same war for 10,000 years. You came, the fragment said. Its voice used Dulavar's speech patterns and something beneath them that was much older. The calculations assigned this as most probable. Most probable is not certain. It is gratifying when the variables cooperate. The Emperor looked at it. What was left of him when you arrived? The man. What was still there when you chose him? Enough to be useful, the fragment said. Enough that his knowledge was native rather than acquired. Enough that the colleagues who might have noticed saw continuity rather than substitution. A pause, the sigils cycling. You ask because you intend to save him. You always intend to save them. And I always do, the Emperor said. Not always. 2 steps forward. The psychic pressure it carried was dense and intricately architected, layer upon layer of adaptive complexity, each stratum designed to reconfigure in response to whatever it encountered. A consciousness built not for power, but for the specific superiority of the mind that cannot be predicted. You did not save the billions of your own psychers who burned reaching for their gifts. You did not save the primarchs who fell. You did not save the son whose blow put you on the throne. No, the Emperor said, I did not. And yet the belief persists, that saving them is possible. What I believe, the Emperor said, is that the question is worth asking. That is the only distinction that has ever mattered between what I am and what you are. The fragment considered this with the particular quality of attention that sentient entities brought to statements that complicated their models. You are smaller than you should be. The projection is constrained. The throne has been consuming the edges of you for 10,000 years, and what arrived here is the fraction that could be spared. It is sufficient, is it? The fragment raised Dulavar's hand, and the Phoenix Nexus flared, not controlled, the way fire flares when a wind catches it, sudden and total and vast. The Phoenix force is extraordinary. Your universe has nothing equivalent. A psychic constant, built into the fundament of this reality itself, as old as this universe's first light, not born of collective suffering, but woven into the architecture of what exists. It burns in every direction at once because it feels what is inside it and cannot find the edges to push against, and I am embedded in the frequencies at its deepest structural level. The copper eyes held the Emperor's. Your technique for containing Chinchian entities is to find the structure beneath the adaptation, the axiomatic, the irreducible point the complexity is built to protect. But I was designed for this engagement specifically. I was placed inside a framework that has no irreducible. The Phoenix Force itself is the structure I am anchored to. To unmount me from this nexus is to unmount the Phoenix from this region of space. I know, the Emperor said. Then you know you cannot do this without burning the nexus clean. And burning the nexus clean requires a force equivalent to the Phoenix itself. The fragment's patterns cycled, assessors running in every direction. You are carrying the psychic equivalent of a candle against what this nexus holds. I know that too, the Emperor said. The fragment went very still. In the stillness, its probability trees were running at full capacity. Then what are you doing? Keeping you here, the Emperor said, while my ally arrives. The stillness deepened. The telepath, the fragment said, and in its voice was the first real quality of something the probability trees had assigned insufficient weight. The telepath, the Emperor confirmed. What happened next was not what the fragment calculated for, and this was the entire point. The Emperor had been sustaining this conversation with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that the most dangerous thing a sentient entity could be given was time to process what its opponent was doing, because every second of analysis was a second it was not adapting to a new attack vector. It had been running probability trees the entire duration of the conversation, modeling the Emperor's possible actions. It had run every scenario in which the Emperor acted. It had not assigned sufficient weight to the scenario in which the Emperor did nothing, in which the Emperor simply held the fragment's attention in conversation while the Phoenix Nexus, feeling the presence of the contamination isolated and separated from its deeper access channels, began to stabilize around the edges. Not healing, not clean, triage. You are not the threat, the fragment said. Realization moved through its copper light like weather. You are the distraction. I am both, the Emperor said, and raised his hand, and pressed. Not fire, not lightning, not the visible apparatus of a psychic attack. He reached into the fragment's deepest available architecture and found the layer he could reach in the time he had, and compressed it. the way a man might press a thumb against a bruise to keep blood from pooling further. Not healing, containment. The fragment's energy pushed back from its Phoenix Nexus access channels, concentrated toward its center, held there by the force of an opposing will that was 10,000 years old and had been doing exactly this, against things exactly like this, for every one of those years. Dulavar's body fell. The fragment, displaced from direct motor control for the first time in months, manifested in the space above the fallen form as something briefly visible, a shape of blue-silver light and constantly reconfiguring mathematics, a consciousness architecture attempting to exist in physical space without the anchor of a host body or the warp's supporting topology. It was large, it was angry, and for the first time since it had arrived in this universe, it was uncertain. The Emperor stood in its light and began the next phase, and held and waited for Jean Davar. Jean Davar received the message from the Shi'ar military consulate at 11:47 p.m. while sitting on the Xavier Institute's roof, watching a meteor shower that had so far produced 3 meteors and 40 minutes of clear winter sky. She read the message twice, then 3 more times. The Shi'ar diplomatic translation was precise and careful and described, with the restrained urgency of military communication trying not to cause panic, the following: a psychic entity of unknown classification, currently engaged in ongoing containment of a dimensional contamination event threatening to destabilize a Phoenix Nexus and potentially open dimensional access between universes, had specifically requested Jean Davar by name. The Shi'ar staff telepath Cositor Vale had noted that the entity's description of Jean's Phoenix resonance pattern demonstrated familiarity with specifics that were not in any Shi'ar intelligence file. Jean folded the message and looked at the sky and did something she did when the world was quiet enough. She reached outward, past the school, past the city, past the planet's psychic noise, out toward the coordinates in the message. She touched something, not an alien telepath, not the Phoenix which she felt the way she felt gravity, always present, usually quiet. Something vastly older and stranger than either. A consciousness of such scale that the fraction of it she could reach from Earth was still overwhelming in dimension, and yet organized, purposeful, directed with intention toward a specific end. A mind that was aware of her awareness the instant she touched it. A mind that had been waiting for her to look. It said nothing. It simply confirmed it was there. Jean was on the phone to the Shi'ar consulate emergency line in 20 seconds. She arrived at Nexus Point 7, 9 hours and 42 minutes after the Emperor's first confrontation with the fragment. This was faster than standard Shi'ar courier routes permitted. Achieved through the Stargate relay system the X-Men maintained emergency access to through a diplomatic agreement 3 years out of date, but not yet revoked, and a Shi'ar military shuttle with orders to wait at the receiving end. She walked off the shuttle and into a monitoring station that smelled of burned psychic shielding and ozone, and something else that had no name in any register she knew, an ancient smell, copper and cold, and the specific quality of deep time. Cositor Vale was waiting. "Telepath Davar." Vale's voice carried the professional warmth of someone who considered Jean a colleague in the specific sense of 2 people who were very good at the same difficult thing. "Thank you. Tell me the situation," Jean said. Vale told her. Jean listened with the quality of attention that good telepaths developed, absorbing information in full before beginning to process it, keeping the reactive layer quiet until there was something coherent to react to. When Vale finished, Jean said, "Take me to him." The secondary monitoring chamber's forward viewport showed a room full of light. Not the Phoenix light Jean knew, something colder at its center, burning at its edges where the Phoenix's frequencies had been drawn in by proximity, like iron running hot near a fire. 2 sources contested the space. The blue-silver lattice of the Tsinchian fragment, ceaseless in its self-reconfiguration, and the Emperor's projection, standing at the room's center with both arms extended, every line of his form burning with the controlled and absolute refusal of a will that did not break. He had been holding this for 9 hours. Jean pressed her hand against the viewport. The Emperor turned his head. Across the distance and the ferrocite and the layered psychic pressure, his eyes found hers with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. and he said into her mind directly, the way very powerful psychers spoke when they needed to be heard above everything else. I need you to hold the Phoenix resonance steady while I reach the fragment's axiomatic layer. It will attempt to use the Phoenix against you when it realizes what we are doing. You must hold the resonance constant, regardless of what the Phoenix does in response. Do you understand what I am asking? Jean looked at the fragment's light, at the Emperor's held stance, at the 9 hours of endurance written in every line of a projection that was, she could see now, thinning at its edges, the cost of sustained containment becoming visible. Who are you? She said. It was the question she actually needed answered. Someone who has been fighting what that thing represents for longer than your civilization has existed, the Emperor said. Someone who cannot tell you everything you want to know right now, because the fragment is monitoring this exchange and will adapt to any intelligence I share with you. Someone who is asking you to trust a judgment I cannot justify to you in the time we have. A pause, carrying the specific weight of a being that did not ask for things easily. I could have taken the Phoenix Force when I arrived. I did not. I could have used your colleagues on this station as instruments. I did not. If you need a reason, let the absence of those actions be the reason. Jean Devar looked at the man who was the farthest thing from a man she had ever encountered, a consciousness 10,000 years old and dying and absolute and still, somehow, asking, and said, "Open the door." The door to the secondary monitoring chamber opened. Jean walked into the light. The psychic pressure was a wall. She had known it would be, and she walked into it the way she had learned to walk into things that hurt, with even pace, shields shaped correctly. The Phoenix resonance that lived in her bones opened to its full active range and held like a note held against a storm. The fragment noticed her the way a forest fire notices a change in wind direction. Immediately, completely, with the specific hunger of something that had identified a new resource. Jean held. She crossed the chamber to the Emperor's left and did not look at him directly. Looking at him directly at this proximity would cost focus she could not spare. She looked at the fragment instead, read its architecture the way she read complex minds, not individual thoughts but structural grammar, the deep syntax of a consciousness, and found what the Emperor had been preparing her for, the Phoenix resonance thread, buried in the contamination's deepest layer, thin as a filament, the axle, the entire elaborate construction rotated around. "I see it," she said. "Good," the Emperor said. His voice, at this range, had the gravity of something that made the air around each syllable feel older. "I am going to reach the axiomatic layer from the exterior, while the fragment's attention is on your Phoenix frequency. You are going to hold that thread constant, so the fragment cannot rotate its architecture away from my approach. When I reach the axiomatic, you will feel the Phoenix pull toward the contamination. You must not allow it. And if the Phoenix pulls toward it anyway, the contamination absorbs sufficient Phoenix force to break my containment and expand to the full nexus. The resonance window opens. Things from my universe cross into yours." He said it simply, without drama, the way one states the conditions of physics. It would be catastrophic at a scale this universe is not currently equipped to manage. "Understood," Jean said. "Don't let the Phoenix feed it." She opened herself to the Phoenix resonance fully. She almost never did this. Not because the Phoenix frightened her, she had moved past fear of it into something more like cautious coexistence, but because full resonance meant the Phoenix was present in her, not alongside her. And the Phoenix did not care about the things she cared about in the precise and human way she cared about them. The Phoenix cared about fire and transformation and the great cycling of what was born and what ended, and everything else was context. She held her own name like an anchor in a current. The fragment struck. Not at the Emperor. It had been testing the Emperor's containment for 9 hours, and had developed a sufficiently precise model of his approach to know that direct assault was inefficient. It struck at Jean, targeting the Phoenix resonance thread with the full deployment of its adaptive architecture, attempting to use the connection between Jean and the Phoenix to invert it, to make Jean a conduit through which the Phoenix would flow into the contamination rather than away from it, to make Jean the key. Inside her own mind, where no one else could hear it, Jean screamed. Outside, her face did not change. She held. The Emperor reached the axiomatic layer. This was not a visible event. It was a structural one, an action taken in the architecture of a consciousness against the foundational mathematics it had been built to protect. The Emperor found the irreducible element the fragment had claimed did not exist, because everything has an irreducible, even the things that are built entirely to hide it, because the hiding of it requires a structure, and every structure has a foundation, and the foundation is the thing you cannot move. And he pressed. The fragment screamed, not a sound, a reality event. The blue-silver light contracted in a spasm. The constant reconfiguration stuttered for the first time in months. The lattice developed a fissure at its core that the adaptation machinery could not close fast enough because the Emperor was holding the fissure open. Dulavar's body on the floor arched upward, and the copper light left his eyes in a single clean pulse. The fragment was not destroyed. It was not even fully contained. It had simply been reached, which was something that had never happened to it before, and in the moment of that reaching, it made the one move it had left. It reached for Jean, not for the Phoenix thread, not for her architecture. It reached for the thing it calculated the Emperor cared about, because sentient entities always find the thing that cannot be lost and deploy it. It pulled Jean's consciousness toward the Phoenix nexus with the full force of months of embedded access, pulling her toward the epicenter of the contamination, beginning the inversion. Jean as conduit, Jean as key, the Phoenix flooding through her into the fragment and giving it the fuel to break through the Emperor's containment and explode outward into the full nexus. The Emperor released the axiomatic layer. He turned and placed himself between Jean's consciousness and the Phoenix nexus and held. The specific thing about a being who had been dying for 10,000 years, who had watched the species he loved burn and endure and sacrifice beyond what any species should be asked to sacrifice, who had made decisions that could not be unmade and bore their weight with the patience of something that had outgrown the option of breaking, was that when given something worth protecting, he did not calculate the cost. He simply held. Jean, anchored by something that was not the Phoenix and not the Emperor, but the contact of a mind that intended to bring her back from where the fragment was pulling her, turned the Phoenix resonance inward rather than outward. She reversed the direction. She forced the thread not toward the contamination but away from it, back along the channel the fragment was using to pull her, back toward the source. And she burned. The Phoenix force, given unambiguous direction for the first time since the contamination began, moved. It moved the way it always moved, absolutely, completely, with the specific indifference to consequence of something that existed before consequence was a category. It swept through the contamination from Jean's anchor point, the way a wave sweeps across sand, total, irresistible, without cruelty or intent, simply thorough. The Tsianqian fragment, at the moment of its axiomatic exposure, with the Phoenix moving through it rather than into it, dissolved. Not defeated in combat, not overwhelmed by superior force, dissolved, the specific fate of a complexity that has been reduced to its irreducible element and found, at that element, nothing the Phoenix force recognized as warranting preservation. The blue-silver light went out. The secondary monitoring chamber was very quiet. Jean became aware that she was sitting on the floor and that the Emperor was kneeling beside her, his projection's hand resting on her shoulder, with the careful quality of someone who understood the gesture's meaning and was uncertain of the protocol. "Is it done?" she said. "The fragment is gone," he said. "The nexus requires cleaning. The contamination's surface architecture is still embedded in the Phoenix's outer frequencies. That is work of hours, not urgency. The resonance window is closed." He studied her. "How much of yourself did you put into that?" Jean took inventory. "About as much as I can afford to and still recognize my own name. Rest," he said. "Then we will finish the cleaning." The cleaning of the Phoenix Nexus took 4 hours. The Emperor worked from the secondary monitoring chamber, reaching into the Nexus with the precision of a surgeon, removing contamination, layer by layer, from tissue that did not need to be disturbed to be healed. Cosita Vale coordinated instruments she had only partial frameworks for. Jean maintained the Phoenix anchor, holding the resonance constant so the Emperor's work did not trigger any secondary fluctuations in the frequencies he was clearing. Thalar Vek watched from the command deck and said nothing that was not operationally necessary. He had the quality, Vale thought, of a man processing a fundamental revision of several operating categories with military patience, filing the revision under actionable intelligence rather than existential crisis, because there was no time for the latter and there was always work for the former. On the third hour of cleaning, Arian Dulavar woke up. Vael was with him in the medical bay when it happened. He came back to himself the way someone surfaces from deep water, slowly, with the specific confusion of a person who knows exactly where they are, but cannot account for the time between when they remember being there last. He opened his eyes and looked at her with the expression of someone who remembered, fully and without mercy, everything that had been done through his hands. "How many?" he asked. "No fatalities," Vael said. "The compromised personnel are recovering. The contamination has been cleared from the Nexus." Dulavar's eyes closed. When they opened again, the edges were wet. "For months I knew something was wrong. I kept finding records I did not remember accessing, reports I did not remember writing. I kept leaving notes in my own files, not words, just patterns, the kind of notation I use when I am working on a problem I have not solved yet." He paused. "Markers. I was leaving markers. Someone found them," Vael said. "In the end, someone found them." He was quiet for a moment. "The entity that asked for the telepath, the one who freed the compromised staff. Is it still here?" "For a little while longer," Vael said. "In the secondary monitoring chamber, the Phoenix Nexus ran clean for the first time in 4 months. The contamination was gone. The resonance window was closed. The fragment that had been patiently embedding itself in the oldest fire in the universe, waiting for this specific encounter, was simply not anymore. Dissolved by the Phoenix it had tried to use, reached by a mind it had not calculated for. Jean felt the cleanness of it, the way she felt sunlight shift, a change in the quality of something that had been slightly wrong, now simply right. The Phoenix burned in its correct register, ancient, total, entirely itself. The Emperor withdrew his attention from the Nexus and looked at her. She had been composing the question she actually needed answered for 3 hours. "When you go back," she said, "is there anything that can be fixed? The throne, the dying, all of it?" He looked at her for a long time. "There are those who work toward it," he said. "Those who believe the answer exists and are searching for it. I have had, in recent years, reason to believe they may be right." A pause. "What I have seen in this universe, in this specific encounter, I did not expect to find. You fight for each other here. Not out of compliance, not because the structure demands it or because the alternative is worse. You simply do it." "Sometimes," Jean said. "Not always. No, not always." He was quiet for a moment, but frequently enough to constitute a pattern, frequently enough to look like a choice being made, again and again, rather than an accident or a reflex. He looked at the Phoenix Nexus, clean and burning and vast through the viewport. "In my universe, hope of that kind was not something I was able to protect at the same time as protecting humanity's survival. I had believed that was a constraint imposed by circumstance." He stopped. "Perhaps it was a failure of imagination." Jean said nothing for a moment. "Then, what are you going to do when you go back?" "Continue," the Emperor said. "There is always more to do than there is strength to do it. That has been true for 10,000 years. It will be true for whatever comes after." He looked at her. "But I will take this with me, what I have seen here, what this universe holds. A beat. It is worth protecting." Jean Devar looked at the man who was the farthest possible thing from a man, a consciousness 10,000 years old and dying, and absolute, and somehow, beneath the weight of all of that, still asking the same questions, still finding things worth protecting, still carrying the grief of what he had sacrificed and not putting it down, and she said, "Thank you for not taking the Phoenix." "I never intended to," he said. "It was never mine to take." Grand Commander Thalar Vek arrived at the secondary monitoring chamber with the bearing of a military officer who had prepared a formal statement and was now quietly discarding it in favor of something more honest. "The Shi'ar Imperium," he said, "is grateful. I am authorized to offer." "Nothing is needed," the Emperor said. "The contamination originated in my universe. What crossed into yours was my responsibility. I have resolved it." Thalar Vek looked at him. There will be questions from the council. The record will need to reflect. Answer them as you see fit, the Emperor said. You are a capable commander. Your telepath is exceptional. Your archivist fought a contamination alone for 3 months and found ways to resist that the contamination did not expect. Your people are worth protecting. His eyes held Thalar Vek's with the weight of something that had evaluated the quality of civilizations for a very long time and did not say this lightly. The universe is larger than either of our empires, remember that. Thalar Vek, who had faced battle-mad gods and planetary sieges and the specific horror of deep void engagements where the enemy was the dark itself, stood straight and said simply, I will. The Emperor looked at John one final time. The Phoenix knows your name, he said. It has known it longer than you have carried it. Whatever you choose to do with that, choose freely. That is the only distinction that matters. John started to speak. He was already gone. The projection dissolved. Not in collapse, not in defeat, but in the quiet, deliberate fashion of a consciousness withdrawing back through the membrane it had crossed, back through the door the contamination had engineered and that he had made briefly useful, back toward the universe that was his, toward the war that never ended, toward the gold and bone and ancient endurance of a throne that was not a seat of power, but a sacrifice so vast it had become architecture. The void above Kyrath's rest was empty. The Phoenix Nexus burned alone against the stars, clean and uncontaminated, the way it had burned for 100 million years before anyone thought to corrupt it. Kositor Vale stood at Jean's shoulder and watched the empty space. Did he tell you his name? She asked. Not exactly, Jean said. What did he tell you? Jean thought about a man who had held something terrible at bay for 9 hours alone in a room, who had asked for trust and been honest about the asking, who had stood between her and the thing that would have used her, and who had looked at a universe of free-burning hope and called it worth protecting without hesitation and without conditions. He told me to choose freely, she said. I think that was the answer. The Shi'ar filed their reports over the following 72 hours. Thalar Vek's account was precise and uneditorialized. Entity arrived, contamination identified, contamination resolved, entity departed. In the margin, in his own hand and not for official record, he wrote the phrase Kositor Vale had used during the initial contact, the phrase she had used because she had no better one, no Shi'ar word. He left it there without addition or explanation. Kositor Vale's psychic contact report ran to 94 pages. The first page carried standard headers and contact summary. The remaining 93 pages attempted, with every technical vocabulary available to Shi'ar psychic analysis, to describe what she had encountered during those initial moments in the shuttle above Kyrath's glass plains. She had been honest in it. She had described what she found with the precision her career demanded. The last line read, "In 47 years of psychic service, I have made contact with beings of extraordinary power. I have never before made contact with something that felt, above all else, like grief shaped into purpose." Arian Dulavar requested reassignment once medical cleared him. He spent his first week back on active duty reviewing every communication he had transmitted in the previous 4 months, building a complete accounting of what had been done through his access and his name. He presented it to Thalar Vek without expectation of clemency. Thalar Vek assigned him to the permanent monitoring station being established at Kyrath's Rest. "If anything approaches that nexus again," he said, "I want someone there who knows what to look for." Dulavar went. Jean Devar flew home through the Stargate relay in the early hours of a morning that felt different from the one she had woken up in, and she sat in the shuttle's forward cabin and held the Phoenix resonance the way she held it when she needed to think clearly. Not opened, not active, just present. A warmth like sunlight through glass. She thought about what the Emperor had said about choosing freely. She thought about a being that had spent 10,000 years making choices from inside a structure that permitted no real choice, where every decision was the calculus of survival and sacrifice and the annihilation of alternatives, and what it must be like to arrive in a universe where that calculus had not yet consumed everything, and to recognize the thing you had lost, the way you recognize a face you have not seen in 10,000 years. She thought he might be the saddest being she had ever met. She thought that was probably why she trusted him. The Phoenix Nexus above Kyrath's Rest burned in its correct register as the shuttle carried her home, and the stars around it were very old and very bright, and the universe that contained them continued as it always had, without knowing what it held, without knowing what moved through it, without knowing the names of the things that watched from its edges. And in the space between universes, in the membrane that was not the warp and not the void, but the boundary between them, something moved back toward the door it had come from. The projection collapsed, the consciousness contracted toward its origin, toward the gold and bone and ancient agony of the throne, toward the body that was a ruin, held together by the will that was not. He had seen, across a dimensional barrier, a universe where his kind still burned freely, where human potential reached upward without being cut down by the weight of gods or the machinery of survival, where a telepath had held a psychic thread against the full force of a Tzeentchian entity and held it because she chose to, not because anything commanded it, not because the alternative was worse, because she had decided. The Emperor of Mankind returned to his dying and his vigil and the 10,000-year war that never ended. He carried the memory of the Phoenix burning clean above a dead world and the sound of a voice saying, "Thank you for not taking it." In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. There had always been only war. There would be only war for 10,000 more years, and the lives of uncounted billions would be the coin spent to keep the darkness back, and the throne would hold, and the Astronomicon would burn, and humanity would endure in the brutal fashion that was the only fashion the universe permitted. But somewhere in that burning dark, a truth persisted that 10,000 years of catastrophe had not erased, that the thing being protected was worth protecting. That hope, even in a universe that had no room for it, was not a delusion. It was not weakness. It was the only thing that had ever been worth any of the cost. It was the reason. It had always been the reason. The throne held, the light blazed, and the Emperor watched, and endured, and did not break.